Hi, and welcome to this HGSE Alumni Engagement Hour on Zoom. I'm Joe Blatt, Senior Lecturer here at the Ed School and Faculty Co-Chair of the Master's Program on Learning Design, Innovation, and Technology. You know, when the Alumni Relations folks invited me to have this conversation with you, they referred to it as a fireside chat. That's an appealing image, and I immediately thought of the actual fireplace that's here at the entrance to Gutman Library. So let's check it out. Oops, no fire. But that's not really a problem. I didn't actually plan to just talk at you for an hour. Instead, my idea is to help you reconnect with HGSE more intimately. So we're going to meet some of the people who make this place what it is. As a sort of parting shot to the fireplace fiasco, I might say we're going to rekindle some happy memories or maybe spark some pleasing nostalgia. And you know, there's no better place to start rekindling your Appian Way vibe than here in the popular center of our community, the Gutman Commons Cafe. And over there, working his magic with today's pasta special, is the iconic head man of the Gutman Cafe, Chef Matt. Hey, Matt.
Hey, how's it going, Joe?
So, Matt, I gotta ask you.
Surely.
Question I'm sure is on everybody's mind. What do students eat the most of?
You know what? My humor? No, they eat the salad bar. They really go for the salad bar. That's ever changing. We do some farmers market goodies in the summer and fall, and that's really what everyone really goes for. It's our biggest seller.
That's really interesting. So they're not just addicted to the junk food. They do the salad. That's great.
But I try to get healthy cereals, and they love those frosted flakes, you know?
So let me ask you this. Beyond the good food that you prepare here, what does the Gutman Cafe mean to you? What really stands out about it in your mind?
Relaxing, oasis from academia. Just sort of, we deliver good vibes, relaxing, little conversation, nothing serious down here at all.
Cool. My sense is that you've been here like 13 years or so. Can you point at some special day or special event that really sticks out in your memory?
Well, not to sound self-serving, but when I really got control of this place and became the chef about 10 years ago, because then I got to really enact how I want this place to be and how I want it to feel down here. So that was the day where I got complete control creatively. That really did it for me.
Excellent. Well, congratulations. And thanks, Matt. So now we're going to meet some of my other guests, some faculty colleagues, who are going to tell us about what's happening here and why and what to make of it. So stick with me. Well, I hope you enjoyed that great performance by Doc and the HGSE Orchestra. What's that? Oh dear, I'm sorry. I guess they thought I meant David Doctorman instead of Doc Severinsen, so we didn't actually have the orchestra. Sorry about that. And there is another problem, which is in true talk show fashion. I plan to tell some jokes as part of a monologue, but the alumni relations folks felt that making fun of Dean Long or any of the obvious subjects would not be the right thing to set this right tone for this conversation. So instead, we'll move right along and let me welcome my first guest, Professor Ebony Bridwell-Mitchell. Hey, Ebony.
Hello, Joe.
So great to have you.
See you. Thank you so much.
Let the folks welcome you here. Make sure we just to see you.
Who are being welcomed here by me and Joe. Good to have you here.
So, I just had a chance to talk to Chef Matt downstairs, and I asked him, what is the thing that students eat the most of? Now, what would you guess is the answer to that?
I think it depends on the day of the week because that pasta bar is popular. But I will say I see a lot of tater tots and pizza go by.
See, that was my answer, pizza. Turns out that he says the salad bar is really the top thing, which makes me feel a little bit encouraged about student nutrition and health, although if you believe it.
Yeah, I question if it's the salad bar,
yeah,
but that
fair
may be
enough.
true.
So one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you with us is because this has been such a big year for you. First tenure and then an endowed chair. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And I think the name of this chair is of special significance to you. You want to tell me about it a little bit?
Indeed. I study organizations, schools as organizations in particular, and the field of organizations is actually pretty new. While people have thought about organizations kind of since the kind of pre-modern times, the official study started with Herbert Simon and Jim March. And the name of my chair is the Herbert A. Simon Professor of Education, Organizational Behavior, and Management.
Wow. So do you have new stationery that will actually fit on?
No, but it actually goes along with my also very long name. I'm Ebony N. Bridwell Mitchell.
Good point. Yeah.
With all of the rest of that to go with it. So.
Fair enough. And this reminds me, we were talking about your latest accomplishments, but I've always been kind of fascinated by the fact that you are, I believe this is right, that your doctorate is from a business school. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
How did you make the transition to education, or how does those things fit together?
Yeah, well, I've actually always studied education. Both of my parents have a background in human services and education. My mom has a doctorate in adult education. My dad has been the head of a community action agency. So baked into me, both genetically and socialization wise, is this idea of service. But my undergraduate degree is in education policy. My master's degree is from a policy school, but I studied education policy. But after that, I kind of figured that I wanted to be the kind of policy person who actually worked in school contexts. And that meant I went to go teach at a school in East New York, Brooklyn, where I learned that policy was important, but what was going on inside schools and the way the organization happened and worked was one of the most important factors. And when you study organizations, the main place where that research happens is inside business schools. Not because businesses know how to run organizations better, but they figured out very quickly that if they could run their organizations well, they could make more money. So that is why most of the research happens at business schools.
And that's, I think, one of the actually many reasons why I always find you so interesting. I hope that there's some TIE alums in our audience, and if so, that they may remember that I think it was the very first year you were here, and I was so intrigued by a talk I heard you give that I enticed you to come talk to TIE, and I've had chances to learn from you ever since, which
You're one
I'm
of my favorite people.
very grateful for. That's really sweet. And then you also share this expertise not just with students here, but I know you've become more and more engaged with our professional programs. Tell me a little bit about is it one institute or several?
Well, I find myself actually across several different institutes kind of that are chaired by my faculty colleagues, but my specialization in those institutes tends to be organizational culture, because a big part of trying to change how organizations work and how we improve schools is actually changing the culture themselves. But this year I am starting 2 institutes of my own, one related to school culture and another one called the School Leaders of Color Organizational Development Collaborative.
Oh, wow. Okay. Say a little bit more about that one. How do you make that special for that audience?
I'm perfectly happy to tell you more about it because I'm very excited about what we're doing. It is a fully online program, so that gives a lot more people across the country access to not just my expertise, but most importantly, to each other's expertise. The core of this program is the collaborative part. So this is really a program that occurs over 8 weeks where people meet together in groups around practice problems that they've identified, but we begin our conversations with some kind of core instruction from me around organizational principles that are important to the problems that they have identified in advance. I had one pilot year that went, in my opinion, and modestly, very well, which is why I'm doing it again.
Not surprised.
And it's been not only a really great opportunity to meet with people who are in the field, but for them to continue to have contact with one another, which is super important because while there are many educators of color who are school leaders and who work in districts, they're often very isolated in those roles. So having other professionals who are like them working on problems like theirs kind of as a cohort, not just during our 6 to 8 weeks, but over time because they stay in touch, has been wonderful to see and kind of develop as a community for folks in the field.
It's so interesting because we always, at least many of us here, talk about the importance of situated learning, of applying the ideas to actual problems, even when you're a residential student here, but being able to do that literally in practice where they are, that's quite terrific.
And I'm also very proud to say, this is the last thing I'll say, I am honestly a modest person, but today it's not coming across that way.
It's okay. It's part of my job here as the host of the show.
It is one of the more, if not most, affordable programs at PPE. We worked very hard to make sure it had a very low price point, again, with the idea of being able to bring in as many people as possible.
Terrific. Actually, of course, if I'm really doing my job, this is where I would say, okay, alums, you just heard about it, write into M&E and apply to be in this cool institute.
It will be happening in fall 2023.
Great. And then meanwhile, here on, I was going to say on Earth, I meant to say on
The
here
ground with us.
here on Appian Way.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way. You're also co-chairing one of the new redesign
Mhm.
programs. So
That's
how's that going? Tell me. You know, we only have 1 year really of alums from these new programs.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining that most of our viewers, our participants,
Mhm.
maybe don't know that much about the
Yeah.
redesign. So
Yeah.
I'd be happy to hear more about it.
So I started here at HGSC when we had our original 13 programs. And at one point, we kind of realized that the better way to serve students in terms of building the capacity of our, while large faculty, a large faculty with limited attention, the best way to use that capacity was to kind of end up going from 13 programs to 5 programs, one of which is Education Leadership, Organizations, and Entrepreneurship, ELOE.
What is it with you and long
You know,
titles?
I think I like more attention than I would admit. And the longer you have to say things related to me, the more I am being attended to.
Do you have a middle name? Maybe you could add that to your...
I do have a middle name. It is Ebony Nyambe Bridwell Mitchell.
All right, there you are. I think,
Kiswahili.
you know, with your professorship that long, I think your name needs to be at least that long. Yeah.
I have to admit that I spend a lot of time explaining to people, this is how you spell it, here's what goes first, but it gets to be a nice point of conversation. But thinking about education, leadership, organizations, and entrepreneurship, I co-chair that with Jen Cheatham, a colleague here. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that, one, we got to design the program together. So the 13 programs were wonderful, but you step into programs as a faculty member with not having as much of a sense of how they're designed and what the goals are, and being able to develop from scratch with a colleague who I respect this set of competencies that we think are most important for people to take with them into the field if they want to be education leaders, if they want to be organization change makers, if they want to start and grow their own ventures in education. And those 5 competencies that we kind of organize all of our work around is kind of leading change and thinking strategically, fostering productive organizational conditions, communicating effectively, navigating politics, but also practicing political inclusion, and being able to develop self and others. And everything that we do is really organized around those 5 core competencies, which makes me very proud.
Do you practice that? I mean, that's amazing. You reel off all 5 of them.
Well, I like to practice what I preach.
Number, you know?
If I'm going to preach those competencies, at the very least, I should know what they are. And I do think they are super important for the kind of impact that we want our students to have in the field. So I commit them to memory because they're important to communicate.
Yeah. I was just teasing.
I know, of course.
I know you live it. And you also mentioned the word ventures, which I think if I had to point to sort of one change in students' objectives, students' learning goals and careers since I've been at the Expo, it's going out and starting ventures or you know, realizing that education, that learning isn't limited to just the public sector.
Yeah.
So, and you have a lot of students who are interested in going out and doing that?
In fact, we do. And it's interesting because for a very long time, we've talked in education about entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship, doing new things inside organizations, intrapreneurship, doing new things outside of organizations in the field, entrepreneurship. But I think for a long time, it was a small set of people who thought of themselves as entrepreneurs, and the world has changed. The needs of the world have changed so dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years, or at least our recognition of the needs of the world have changed very dramatically. And I think lots of students are realizing that while the existing institutions that we have are important for kind of stabilizing the way our education system works, they're not always the best for getting the kind of push that we need to think very differently about how we live our lives and the work that we do. And I think students are very excited to make a change in the world. And in fact, that is, of course, our motto, learn to change the world. And students are figuring out how to do that for themselves.
Right, exactly. And this is a pretty special time for those, not so much for the students you're teaching right now, but for next year's students, because we're right in the middle of the admissions and yield cycle. What are y'all doing to you know, make sure we get the students we want?
Well, I already have given you my pitch around the 5 core competencies, but we do spend a lot of time, not only in the development of our materials, but in the early conversations we have with students once they're admitted. So we admit some large subset of students, but only a few of those kind of end up coming for a variety of reasons. So making sure that this program is the best fit for them is what's most important. Of course, Many people are excited to come to Harvard, and that is wonderful. But what's most important for us is that students are excited about making impact by growing along those 5 core competencies. So in our orientations conversations, in the conversations we have with our assistant director and people who might call her up or send her an email, we really try to emphasize to these 5 core competencies and the idea of having impact in the field around agency for students and staff, around excellence in our field, around the kind of access and equity we think is important. If that's what excites you, then this is the right program for you. And we spend a lot of time trying to help people think about that fit for themselves.
And it's coming to a boil right now, right?
Yes,
Is it Thursday that you're going to be seeing the?
I think it is. We actually had an online introduction and open house last week, and the in-person one is in fact this Thursday.
Okay. Now, I'm just gonna make a suggestion. When you welcome them, don't try to say your whole name and your professorship, and because then you run out of time.
It will be 10 minutes. It will be the 10-minute intro, but it will be the
So I
Ebony
just want to
Show.
make sure you have time to talk to them. Last thing, and I know you're teaching this afternoon, right?
I am in about 40 minutes. My class on the organization science of school improvement.
Oh, cool. What's going to be the topic today?
Oh, wow, Joe. You probably shouldn't have asked because it is one of my most, like the topics I love the most. So I will try and keep it brief. But this session, we're talking about cognition and decision-making and the way we take in information, how we interpret it and then respond to it based on our emotions has a huge impact on how we make decisions. And that impact comes through in many ways, including the kinds of cognitive biases that we implicitly hold and we may not realize are shaping our decisions, including implicit biases related to race and gender and other social background factors.
And the goal is to help students discover that in themselves and then deal with it?
3 goals. We talk about in this class the importance of reflective leadership, meaning understanding how cognitive processes are playing out inside one's own mind. But we also talk about diagnostic leadership, using these cognitive skills to really understand how are stakeholders and members of organizations making the decisions that they're making. But we also talk about this idea of kind of strategic leadership. How do we take what we know about how cognition and decision making works to help people broaden their understanding or refine their understandings in ways that will actually lead to more effective decision making and the kind of outcomes we want for schools.
Right. Well, I'm going to let you go to work in just a minute, go to teach. But one last question. You know, between inventing and running PPE sessions, teaching, all the research that you do, what do you do for fun?
Oh, Joe, I'm a bit of a homebody. So I am most happy in my pajamas, watching a good movie with popcorn and chatting with a few friends over a glass of wine.
Well, since we're sort of chatting with friends right now, I should have asked you to wear pajamas for this conversation.
You might have been able to talk me into it under the right circumstances, including having had that wine already.
Fair enough. Well, listen, have a great class.
Thank you so much,
for
Joe.
joining us here.
It's been great.
Ladies and
Thank
gentlemen,
you.
Professor Bridwell Mitchell, I won't try to do the whole thing, but co-chair of ELOE.
That's exactly right.
Terrific, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Joe. Bye, everyone.
Of course. That was great, and I'm sure we're going to keep going great because I want to welcome my next guest, Junlei Lee. Hi, Junlei.
Hey,
How you
good to
doing?
see you.
So glad to have you.
Everybody.
Thanks for joining me. Now, I didn't ask you this. Are you tired of talking about your life with Fred Rogers, or can I ask you a question about that? Because
You're welcome.
you are the only ed school faculty member, at least that I'm aware of, who has been in a major theatrical documentary. I can't tell you. I think I met you when you were thinking about coming here, and then I went to the movies and saw the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood movie. And there's this guy, I know that guy, and it was you talking about your work with him at the Fred Rogers Center. So just tell me a little bit about that.
Well, so I went to graduate school in Pittsburgh, and I was in Pittsburgh for 20-some years. So for anyone, anyone who's seen Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it's actually produced right there in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh was the original kind of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And so going through graduate school there, I was just absolutely enthralled by a little children's program, in part because I thought the program was teaching me something about human development that I wasn't learning in my graduate studies.
Interesting.
And so anyhow, I think without planning to, I directed the rest of my career trajectory towards trying to understand that work, trying to understand how that work can impact the real world. and ended up being a faculty and a director of what was then known as the Fred Rogers Center, a center that was established to carry on kind of that work in the real world.
Now, I'm sorry, I don't remember how long ago Fred died. I remember the time because the millions of people in the country who were really sad that his passing. Did your kids ever get to meet him, or did that not work?
No, I mean, my children met him the same way
Oh,
millions of children
yeah.
did, on television in the mornings, and watched him. When I was a graduate student, other students would say that sometimes they'd see him walking behind campus because he lived like right behind. He lived about a block from where our psychology department was. But
You know, that's funny. I used to walk across the Cambridge Common coming to the ed school, and in the old days, I would often cross paths with B.F. Skinner. You know,
oh yes, wow.
The icon of behavioral psychology. I just never had the courage to go up and ask him a question or introduce myself or anything. But Fred would have been more approachable, I think, than B.F. Skinner.
People would stop him all the time,
Uh-huh.
and then his colleagues, who's always trying to usher him from one meeting to another, would get very frustrated because he couldn't just stop and say, "Hey, how are you? See you later."
Uh-huh.
Like he would ask about your family. He want to learn anything about you, even if he's like on his way to the White House. He would just stop at the intersection and talk to people.
That's funny. Well, I have to say that I don't know if it's contagion or whatever, but I will say that after being there, you came here and instantly, really just overnight, became one of the most popular faculty members here. I can't tell you how often advisees or students of mine just start raving about their learning with you. It kind of makes me annoyed, actually, but I try to be pleasant about it. So tell me a little bit about the classes you teach and how it is that this chemistry is so effective with students.
Well, Joe, I just want to tell you something. So before I came here, I was nervous, right? So every time you go to a place, you're trying to figure out kind of what kind of human relationships are taking place in this place between, let's say, faculty and student. So I was online Googling. And I found these videos of you in your class and your class surprising you to thank you with the puppet. But it wasn't just them thanking you with the puppet. It was the relationship that implied. And I just there was something that was both challenging because I feel like, oh, I have to live up to that. But on the other hand, it was so heartwarming that from coming from outside Harvard, like people have ideas about what Harvard is. And then coming to HGSE, you find this kind of very grounded and warm experience.
Wow. Well, I'm here. I'll drink to that.
Oh, this has real water. I thought it was a prop.
Hey, no expense spared on this talk show,
That's
pal.
right. That's right.
I want you to know I got the name of that reservoir for that water. Got very special water. So
But
anyway,
you were asking
about your classes.
the
and
classes,
the obviously the subjects that connect so clearly with our students. Yeah.
Well, so it just so happens that the class that I choose to teach over and over again is a class called Empowering Human Relationships. And as a psychologist, first focused on children and now probably more on grown-ups, I think it was just so critical that we understand that human development is driven by the quality of the human relationships. And if anything, the last few years of the pandemic, particularly the shutdowns, was this reminder of how much our well-being was tied to be able to have these relationships, like physically as well as virtually around us.
Right.
So the class was about empowering human relationships across contexts. And it's always really exciting to have just students, coming from all different settings, from schools to social work, to nonprofits, to higher ed, and students coming from all over the world, bring their experiences and stories about relationships and share this common commitment about whatever we do, right? We could be an education designer, we could be a school leader, we could be a teacher, we could just be a parent in our own lives. That whatever we do, it touches human relationships, and there's always something that we can do to strengthen the quality of human relationship around it. So that's the course that
well, I can see why that would be infinitely useful, right, in all realms of one's life. How do the students practice putting the ideas together? Do you you do things in class that entail behaving to one another?
Yeah. Well, we actually thought that the most important foundational practice of human relationship isn't to jump to do something, but to be able to notice, to sit back and notice and understand it. So one of the things we do every single class is we would take these videos that my colleagues and I collected over well over a decade from different places in different countries. And these are not edited videos in a studio. These are videos that, imagine if you're a fly on the wall, this is what you see, right, in a school or on a street corner. And we would put that video up, and we would, sometimes we'll play a video for, let's say, 12 seconds long. And we would go through like a 40-minute discussion about everything that is happening in those 12 seconds. And I think part of the point through this kind of a practice, one, right, is to understand how human relationships work through even just the most simple everyday interactions. But the other part was to help to convey this idea that even 12 seconds of human interaction have enormous potential and enormous power for the people who are involved in these interactions. I mean, all of us can probably think through in our own lives the interactions we've had with people who loved us or people we love, but as well as perhaps sometimes strangers, and how even a tiny interaction means a lot to us.
Right. So interesting. I don't know if you noticed, but as soon as you started that and you said we should sit back and take notice, I found myself sitting back and sort of listening in a different way. It's a very powerful idea, especially for those of us who maybe are too prone to jump into things. Although, of course, being a talk show host, that's kind of a professional responsibility. But yeah, I'm going to learn from you. And now that class is kind of central to the new human development program, is it?
So the human
I say new, although I know human development's been part of the fabric of the ed school forever, but newly redesigned.
Yeah, I think the human development and education program is kind of the big umbrella that probably pulls together maybe 5 or 6 programs that we used to have, like human development and psychology, prevention science, mind brain, learning, and
remember, you're talking
literacy.
To alums
Right.
who will be resonating
That's
with
right.
this list.
And all these programs now kind of falls under this umbrella called human development and education. And the intent was that each of us may have these specific interests, right, and specific experience, but all of us are deeply committed to support human development, from babies all the way to grown-ups, from the people we serve as well as ourselves. And so this bigger human development umbrella is this idea that you might be interested in babies and infants, you might be interested in reading, and someone else may be interested in mental health and counseling, but that there's some thread that connects all of us, right? Because we're here for human beings, we're thinking about human beings, and of course we are human beings. So the particular program experience, which I know you teach too, but for human development, which is a program that Dr. Meredith Rowe and I co-chair, and the core experience was something that was developed collectively by many faculty, but Stephanie Jones and I have taught that several times. And I think over time, what we've come to is this idea that there are these threads, or what we call through lines, that connect everyone who's in the human development and education field. I'll give one concrete example. So for example, we thought that if you're in human development, and if you're in an institution like Harvard, thinking about research and data, we thought that was really important for anyone in the human development and education field to have this humility on that what counts cannot always be counted. So just to push everyone to think about what really counts in your life, in the life of a child, in the life of a school, right? What are the things that really matter to these human beings? And then hold that in one hand, and then hold up all the metrics that we use to measure schools or children or ourselves, and just put the two together to know that sometimes these two things overlap, and sometimes there are things that really count that we can't measure
Mm.
easily. But just to have that awareness,
Uh-huh.
we think is really important to be a professional in the human development and education
Well,
field.
that makes great sense to me. In fact, that mantra that you hear a lot about, it's not meaningful unless you can measure it, unless there's a metric for it, clearly just doesn't apply universally.
That's right.
I also think that might be a misquotation from Deming. I don't know if you've ever seen that before, that he was actually saying, people say you can't, it doesn't count if you can't measure it, but that's not always true.
That's
So, it just goes to show what happens to important quotations.
That's right.
So you mentioned Meredith, and I know you both both actually have Zants in your titles,
Mhm.
but you've now also reached out internationally as well as the Zants program domestically, right? What are you doing internationally?
So I've always been inspired by work that takes place in developing countries, in countries that doesn't have a lot of material, professional, or even human resources, and to see kind of what high quality practices look like in low resource settings. I think a lot of times we are used to seeing or assuming that high quality practices takes place in high resource environments.
Right.
But what was really inspiring was to go to settings where they have limited resources, but see the incredible kind of practices that emerges. So in part of our work, this was with another early childhood pioneer here, Catherine Snow,
Oh, yeah, great.
along with our colleagues in China. We are in this multi-year project trying to figure out how do we support teachers in low-income rural communities who are starting preschools. So the larger program is called One Village, One Preschool, right? So it's this idea that every village could have a preschool.
Neat.
But these villages couldn't, doesn't have the resources, the salaries to attract the kind of teachers, right, that you would see working in the big cities and so on. So a lot of times these teachers come from the villages themselves. So then the idea was, how do we support that? And I think the exciting part for us, it's not just about that work. I think so many students come to Hugsy and leaving Hugsy and going into wherever they are in the world are doing exactly that.
Right.
They are supporting professionals in low resource communities, and they're supporting their practices. So to be able to do this kind of work, create opportunities for us to think and learn together at HGSC, but more importantly, I think it prepares us to work in places that are far less resourced than the HGSC environment that we're familiar with.
So I gotta ask you one last question. I know that to let you. In fact, you're headed out of town this afternoon, right? Where are you headed?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. You going to a conference or something?
Going to a conference to speak about that very thing, about how do we support high quality practices.
Good. Well, I'm glad to give you a rehearsal
Thank you
opportunity
very
here.
much.
You just remember. So, but the thing I wanted to ask you is, with the with that big project, these very popular classes that you teach, we talked about, the Human Development Education program that you co-chair. I don't think you have much time left, but what do you do for fun when you're not doing all that work?
Well, I just discovered recently, down the block from us is the theater, is the American Repertoire Theater, right? And so whenever I could, I would take my family to go see a show just down the block from my office. I couldn't believe that I think the pandemic just kind of blocked it out. And when the pandemic was over and the theater reopened, I was like, wait, what? It's just.
Oh, that's cool.
Right,
especially because a lot of those shows go to Broadway, so you're getting.
They did. They had Life of Pi earlier this year, and I was in New York City for work last week, and there's Life of Pi on Broadway. That same team that did Right Down the Block is right now on Broadway.
That's cool.
So,
well, I don't want to make you miss your plane, so I'm going to say so. Thanks so much,
Thank
ladies
you,
and gentlemen. This is Junlei Lee, really super popular instructor here, HDE head. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to see you, Joe.
Take care. Have a good trip. And I forgot to say when I was welcoming Ebony that this is a Zoom webinar, and you're most welcome to submit questions over the chat function of the Zoom, and we'll try to answer some of them before the end of the show. But I don't want to keep going about that now because I have another terrific guest to share with you. Coming in, let me introduce Sarah Dryden Peterson. So great to see you, Sarah. Thanks so much for being here.
You too.
Oh, great.
Wonderful. This is exciting.
Well, it's fun. I mean, the orchestra didn't show up for the big opening, and my jokes were canceled. But otherwise, I think things are going pretty well. Julie seemed to be amazed that we actually are serving water in the mug, so feel free to help yourself
Cambridge
to that.
water. I love it.
But listen, I want to start by congratulating you. This is now Professor Dryden Peterson with tenure, very major development in an academic career. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Has life changed at all since that happened?
I mean, it's a good feeling. I was telling the story the other day that in the aftermath of this promotion, it seemed like there was cake at a lot of different events. So every day I would come home with a different cake. And so our kids, who are teenagers now, came to expect that every day I would come home with new cake and we could eat cake for dinner. So that thankfully has stopped for a bit.
You have to live up to that.
I have to live
now,
up
right?
to this, like cake every night for dinner.
I'm going to call King Arthur and tell him to be ready to hear from you. Yeah.
Exactly. Bulk order.
And you know, we're speaking with alums, and I'm sure many, and actually the whole point of this show is to try to kind of reignite their nostalgia and affection for HGSC. So I think probably food everywhere is one of the motifs of this place, which is really great. We know that supports learning, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I am such a fan of your research. I think it just, I mean, basically I feel like this could just be my naivete, but it feels like in many ways you've invented a field of understanding refugee education as not something that is just a short-term thing because it's the refugee problem is short-term. This is something we're living with. So tell me a little bit about how you got into that field and what you've done there.
Sure. I mean, it's a long story in some ways, but I think hinges on a couple of key moments and relationships. That I grew up in Canada, and I was fascinated by history teaching in particular, because I realized early on that the history I learned in English in an English speaking school was different than my colleagues, peers who were going to school in French language schools.
Interesting.
And I became really interested in this idea of, well, what does it mean to kind of write history differently? And how does that influence the way people come to understand where they live? And how does it connect to the kinds of conflicts that we see around the world? And so I spent time after college in South Africa in the late 90s, thinking about this question also of how does a country that has taught a very divisive, very racialized, very white dominant history curriculum think about what happens next in terms of reconciliation and nation building. And in spending time in schools, I really started to think a lot also about migration, because this was a time of a lot of movement in South Africa, that movement that hadn't been previously allowed. And so people making new homes in new places. And so bringing together these interests in history teaching and in migration really led me to think a lot about, well, what does it mean for people to learn while moving and while in these constant processes of change. And I think that was really solidified when I was a middle school teacher and teaching students who had migration experiences, some of whom had been forced to flee their homes, and realizing as a teacher that I felt like I didn't know enough and understand enough about the kinds of educational experiences and kinds of learning experiences that they had had before we ended up together in the same classrooms. And those kinds of questions really led me into this research over the longer term.
And a lot of that research was here as a doctoral student, I know. Were you traveling a lot while you were a doctoral student? Did you actually go to
I was. Yeah. So I guess the year before I started my doctoral studies here, I was living in Uganda and doing the first research that I did on refugee education there. And so that project was actually ongoing while I was a doctoral student. It wasn't my dissertation, it was a separate project. But I often talk to my doctoral students about how having this project that kept me really connected to students, to teachers, to communities, even during the early stages of doctoral work, felt really important to me, because I think often years of coursework as a doctoral student can feel fairly removed from the kind of work that often brought people to doctoral studies in the first place. And so being able to have that continued connection to the kinds of places and the kinds of ongoing teaching and learning in classrooms that I really cared about was incredibly helpful and I think motivating for me in the work I was doing going forward.
And of course, I've had the privilege of learning from you in various talks here. Many of our guests, I hope, had the good fortune, the wisdom, I should say, to take classes with you. But now some of that insight is now available to everyone thanks to this, right? So I'll do the honors here. This is Sarah's new book, Right Where We Belong, published by and available, I'm sure, from Amazon and other sources, right? Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what it's been like to get that out in the world.
Sure. An adventure, I think, in many ways, which is, I think, what writing is all about, too. We learn so much by actually writing. And I think one of the things that was important to me about this book is that I kind of stopped and started with it a number of times because I thought I was going to write a book about a particular study or about a particular piece of research. And I kept feeling like I didn't have enough of the answer to all of the questions to really tell a whole story that I wanted to tell in a book until a certain moment, and decided to write a book that really brought together research from many different studies into one book. And this was, I think, both the opportunity and the challenge of how to think about writing a book that could talk about many different places, many different types of education systems, many different nuances to the kinds of conflict, to the length of displacement, and do that in a way where it could hold together, but also show some of the interconnections across these places. And so I ended up deciding to try to focus on a few different students and teachers who would reappear in different places in the book and become kind of touchstones for these types of themes that emerged across the whole research. And so thinking about, well, what does it mean for people to have to live in a place without legal status for long periods of time? And particularly, what does that mean for education? Right. So as you think about not knowing whether legally you could be in this place tomorrow or 2 weeks from now, does that shape the way we think about what kind of education is most supportive of young people? Does that shift the way young people think about their investment in that education? How do we think about that kind of continuity? Questions around what do different pedagogies look like for students? What do students really want out of their education in these different places, especially not knowing what the future will look like? And so often our schools are really designed for a particular place in a particular moment. And they assume a long-term future in that place. And they assume that the kind of knowledge, the kinds of skills that young people develop will be used in the United States, for example, whereas individuals' experiences are much more transnational than that, particularly those who have been forced to flee their homes. So I really wanted to try to represent this movement, this centrality of movement across places and over time in the book. Right.
And part of what I meant by saying you're really field building here is that it's such a brilliant work of synthesis to bring these stories together so that themes both emerge and are clear and also documented and have a texture with the human stories. I think so often in our field, unfortunately, people do either very abstract stuff that doesn't have that human feel, or they just put stories together without really threading them and coming up with a thematic extra value. So you've really done an amazing piece of work here. Do you have doctoral students who are following in your footsteps, so to speak?
Well, I think it's good for everyone to lay their own footsteps. But I have amazing doctoral students who I've loved working with, and I think that in some ways, like, any kind of field building is a collective endeavor. And so that's doctoral students and colleagues who are doing incredibly interesting work around migration, around history teaching, around some of what I think are the big questions that our field really needs to think about going into the future of what does it mean to think about pretty constant disruptions to schooling as we think about conflict, climate change, the ways in which our education systems need to be able to be ready and to adapt to constantly changing circumstances. And I think a lot of our students are really working on these questions.
Yeah, and speaking of that, changing circumstances and adapting, I'm imagining that both because of the pandemic in the negative sense and technology in a positive sense, the methodology for this kind of research must have changed enormously since when you started.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are lots of things we've learned about methods over the past 3 years, some of which those of us who've been working in conflict settings have been doing a lot because we've had to adapt to constantly changing closed borders, open borders, being able to be there in person given a conflict situation or not. But I think some of the real lessons for research method from over this time, I mean, one is really about trying to listen enough to know the kinds of questions that need to be asked. And I think this comes back to what Junlei was saying before too, of like, how do we know what counts? And what we've found in our work is that we have to listen to young people and to teachers to really think about what is it that drives our research questions and what we're working on. And I think because things shifted so much during the pandemic, it forced a lot of us as researchers to really try to listen and figure out what we should be doing in this scenario rather than just continuing with our research programs as usual. And I think the other is really about partnerships. So when one can't be there in person, are there ways in which it forces us into developing partnerships that actually are stronger for the work in the first place? And so thinking about who has power in different types of research partnerships, how is power distributed, how do we work together collaboratively, given the kinds of affordances of technology that we've come to discover, I think, in many ways over the past few years.
That's so interesting. As you know, I do a lot of work with Sesame Workshop, and they've been engaging in refugee education in the Middle East and in other regions as well. And it's just been fascinating to see the changes in that institution, always known for research, but learning how to do it very differently, always known for putting kids first, but learning now a world audience. And so I know what you mean about that.
Yeah, I think the last time I was in the studio, I was talking to Elmo.
Well, talk about being one up.
Not at all.
Here I thought I was doing a good job as a talk show host, but
this is fabulous.
Now this really makes me feel bad because if I'd only brought my Muppet with me, you could have had a dual Muppet experience. But what can I say? So I don't want to keep you much longer, but I do want to say between writing a book, I know you have kids, doing all the work that's required to succeed here and teach well and get tenure and so on. Probably don't have a whole lot of time, but what do you do for fun when you're not struggling with the world's refugee education problems?
Yeah, I mean, I love spending time with our family. We do a lot of walks outside, hikes in the mountains. We love the winter. We've had far too little snow this year to cross-country ski and snowshoe. We do a lot of baking. So even though cake is not coming home with me, we make cake at home.
Very elegant, bookending the whole conversation. I like that. Well, where exactly do you live? Because I really like cake. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, come on over. Anytime.
No, Sarah, it's just such a pleasure to get to talk to you. Thank you
as
so
well,
much.
Joe.
And I'm just going to hold up the book one more time and try to do it right this time so that everyone can see it, because it's really an important book that people ought to read.
Well, thank you. This
Thank
is
you
just
so
great.
much.
Thank
Really great
you.
to see you.
Good
Thanks
to see
for
you
coming.
too. Keep well.
So I thought I would just share, first of all, just to remind you, if you do have questions and want to send them in through Zoom, that would be great. But I thought I'd just share a couple of news notes with you about the Ed School, because we really do hope that you still feel very connected, that you'll feel free to come by and visit us on Appian Way, take advantage of the salad bar and Chef Matt's other treats. So I want to let you know about a couple of things that are happening. You've heard a lot about the redesigned master's program. You may or may not know that we also have just launched this year an online master's program aimed especially at people who are fairly senior in their careers, who are going to continue to work while they take a 2-year course with us. And I think there's good possibilities that we might want to grow this online learning opportunity into other areas beyond policy and leadership, which is the focus of the current program. It's a big deal for any Harvard school to get permission to conduct a degree program online. We're the first ones, as far as I know, to do that. And I know that Dean Long wants to think about building that. And speaking of building, our second news note is to know that there's a lot of change in this building, the Gutman Library. You'd be glad to know the cafe is still there, robust as ever, but almost everything else in the first 2 floors is changing. And over the next, I think it's already started with the library being somewhat reconfigured, more learning spaces being available, and some of the books and other materials moving off site. And then into that space on the 2nd floor and into some of the 1st floor, all the sort of student-facing offices are going to be located. So admissions and enrollment services of various kinds will now be in the Gutman Library, no longer in Longfellow. And I frankly don't know what's going to happen in that vacated Longfellow space. So we'll have to get back together and talk again when that happens. And then the last thing I was going to mention is that, like I'm sure many or all of you, everyone here is talking about Chat GPT and what that might mean for education, for learning, for us as in higher education, and for children and tweens and teens as well. No answers yet. We're really just trying to catch up the way I'm sure you are, but that's something that maybe we can talk about in a future conversation. But let me see if my encouraging you to ask questions on chat has gone anywhere.
Okay, Joe, one question from a senior alum, his words, senior alum. How do you stay engaged or involved with HGSE?
Well, as a senior and faculty member, only in the sense that this person means I'm not a member of the senior faculty, but certainly one of the aging crowd here. So I welcome the interest and the question. I think among the many ways, let me just mention 3. One is that alumni relations and other divisions of the school are making more and more online programming, not all of it kind of just for fun and interest sake like this, but often with real content about education issues. So watch for the announcements of online events. A second is our online professional education programs. I spoke with Ebony about 2 new institutes that she's creating, and we're really making a very serious effort to get the cost of those down so they become feasible for more and more people. So look out for PP institutes. And then the third way, as I started mentioning a little while ago, is we're always happy to see alums. So, just let us know if you can be in town, and we usually try to make time for a coffee or sit outside for a few minutes and catch up. So we're always looking forward to those revisits.
Okay, next question, Joe. You asked our guests about their programs, their master's programs that they work with. Tell us a little bit about the LDIT program and what's happening now.
Oh, terrific. Well, thanks for whoever asked that. That's the Learning Design, Innovation, and Technology program that builds on the strengths of our previous technology program, but also the learning and teaching and arts and education, brings all those interests in both curriculum design and pedagogy, and also using media of all different kinds for both formal and informal learning. And I'm really happy to say that along with my co-chair, faculty co-chair Joe Almeida, we had 180 students the first year of the program. We didn't know, when you launch it's like holding a party. You don't know if you're going to have anybody, and we were thrilled to have actually too many, because we couldn't fit you all in the space in the Gutman Conference Center. So this year we limited it to 140, 150, I guess, and we have that. And we're about to meet on Thursday some of the folks we've admitted for the coming year. So I think it's going well. Thank you.
A follow-up question, and our last question for you. For those of us who went through TIE decades ago, a lot of the technology we learned about our degree is now old hat. What technologies and innovations should we be paying attention to now to stay fresh and current in our field of ed tech media?
Well, saluting all the TIE alums who are committed to continuing to be up to speed and so on. That's really great question. So I would say 3 things actually. One is we really tried to emphasize when you were here teaching and learning with us, principles, things about how people learn and so on, which we hope are still perfectly relevant despite the changes in technology. Second, I'm particularly interested in augmented reality because I think that that is a wonderful way to bridge digital technology with the real world and get the benefits of both without isolating kids or people from actual experience. And then, as I mentioned a minute ago, I think artificial intelligence is going to have just an unbelievably profound impact on teaching and learning. And it's happened so quickly that we're just trying to figure out how to grapple with even bringing it into our own courses, let alone thinking about how to work with it in to a larger population. But that's something that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about in a future interaction like this, especially enjoying taking over the library like this and using the facilities of the studio and just kind of making it into a more modern place with using the technology that we were just talking. Excuse
Hi,
me,
Joe. How are you doing? This is a library.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that a problem?
No, yeah, I'm glad that you're giving a good
I'm
talk.
just
Yeah,
kidding.
Nice to meet you.
Turn around and let everybody see you. This is everybody knows Dinesh.
Right.
In
yeah,
fact,
great. Yeah.
Dinesh,
Hello,
look up
everybody.
Dinesh, look over here so people get a
Right.
good look.
Yeah.
Because
Hi, everybody.
when I
I'm
said that
Dinesh.
we were going to, bring alums back to make them feel nostalgia, good memories, I know the first thing that would come to their mind is you.
Oh, thank you, Joe. Yeah.
And that's been recognized, right? Some award or something? Tell me about that.
Yeah, I recently got awarded by in 21st Alumni of Color Conference,
Uh-huh.
which happened this March. On 4th, I was awarded with Tina Hanser Educational Equity Award. That's awesome. I really feel great, having a great honor, with that award. And thank you.
No,
I
that-
love the students. They love me. I love you guys. I love them. I love them to succeed. For their goal. And obviously, you guys are awesome to teach them, to succeed them in our Hugsy.
Well, it comes across so clearly. It's always just such a pleasure to see you there at the front door. And in fact, I probably shouldn't keep you from doing that because I don't want the whole place to be emptied.
Right.
People walking out, all this
Right.
stuff. So thanks for looking at us,
Thank you
Dinesh.
so
Really
much, Joe.
great
It
to
was
see
such a
you.
pleasure to meet you, again here, right?
Yeah, and I think you should host the next one. So okay,
Right.
so we'll
Thank you.
we'll
Yeah.
talk to you about that. I have to
Yeah.
get union rules though. I'll have to talk to you about
Right.
that.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah.
You-
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Dinesh. Thanks
you.
for coming by.
Everybody, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And I guess,
Michelle?
if you didn't like what happened, if you thought this was nuts, here's the person to blame, not me. Here, Emily, sit down, please. This is Emily Williams, who's our relatively new director of
1 year.
alumni relations.
That's right.
And, when she asked me to host this event, I said, okay, but I want to do it in a somewhat different way. And you were very gracious about letting us do this kind of nutty talk show idea. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Joe.
And we had a question about all the things that ways to for alums to engage with the school. And I vamped a little bit, but you're the expert. Please share some of that with us.
Well, you broke the mold today. As many of you have seen, we're offering Fireside Chats with faculty, and Joe is our third in this series. We have another coming up with Dr. Karen Mapp on April 4th, so please register. That's on the alumni community. We have the alumni community site. We want you to engage in groups and conversations with folks, so we hope you take advantage of those opportunities. We're coming to you live in Chicago on April 14th for a reception around the AERA reception or conference, and lots more to come. Industry coffee chats with alums, so give us your feedback. We'll send an email around with a survey for today. Tell us what you loved. I mean, nobody does it better than Joe. Can we all just give one more applause for Joe?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we hope to just engage you wherever you are. I saw folks from all over on the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Joe, for giving your time and your brain power to this
Oh, it was fun,
masterpiece.
Emily. And as I said, thank you for indulging me in this unusual format. Just one last reminder, Karen Mapp, next one is
April 4th
April 4th. And
at 12, I
do-
think,
do
Eastern.
people need to register for that?
Yes, you can register on the alumni community just as you did for this one.
Great. And I will say that Karen is both much smarter and much deeper than I am. So you should definitely, don't let this discourage you. Please come back and learn from Karen. And we'd love to see you anytime you want to come back on Appian Way. So thanks
That's right.
thanks very much for joining us today. and come back for Karen on April 4th and other events that Emily's told us about. Take care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.